This story, The Man Who Lived Too Long, is set shortly after the financial crash of 2006 to 2008. In his late 80s, Silas Robbins was a statistical anomaly because most of his cohort of babies who were born in 1919 had already departed this life. And of those who remained, many displayed infirmity of mind or body or both. Silas was the exception. He retained an erect posture, a sprightly gait, a shock of snow-white hair, and an intellect that included an acerbic wit. Silas was a resident of Shropshire Place, a retirement home whose monthly cost at that time was nearly $4,000. This was a matter of some distress to his 3 children, who watched with dismay the progressive shrinkage of the estate that they had hoped in due time to inherit. Shropshire Place was owned and operated by Retirement Horizons, whose business plan for retirement and nursing facilities involved niche marketing. Shropshire Place targeted a waspish clientele. A companion facility, Mount Zion, was aimed at the Jewish market, and the principal residents of Galway Bay were Irish Catholics. Waspish touches at Shropshire Place included a library with hunting prints on the walls and subscriptions to several British magazines, as well as afternoon tea in the drawing room at 4 o'clock, where tea bags were eschewed in favour of loose tea leaves steeped in china teapots. Silas himself was Canadian born and bred. He was, however, something of an Anglophile, having been stationed in England during World War II. There he had met the love of his life, Violet Ash, known universally and unaccountably as Daisy, who had become widowed earlier in that conflict. Silas and Violet had been married in 1945 at Violet's country parish church. Thereupon, Silas brought his war bride to Ontario. Their 3 children were born by the middle 1950s. As a result, they were now all at or approaching retirement age. Their impatience for Silas's estate could be ascribed principally to generational differences in the handling of their finances. Silas and Daisy had known the deprivation of the Depression and the war years, and so they were better at savers. By contrast, the children at the leading edge of the baby boom generation were far less provident, having chosen to enjoy the material comforts and conveniences of life to the maximum during their careers. They now found themselves still indebted as they faced retirement, and thus considerably less than certain that their resources would suffice should they live to the age of their parents. Daisy had died in her early 80s, almost 10 years previously. Silas kept on the house and tended the garden for another 5 years, but decided eventually that the time had come to move into a retirement facility. This was not for want of vigour towards the upkeep of home and garden, for he had a house cleaning service twice weekly and a lawn maintenance service in the summer. Rather, it was a lack of company of people of his own generation. The street where he and Daisy had made their home for so many years was undergoing yet another generational turnover, as the remaining older residents moved away or died. Silas found that he had little or nothing in common with the latest crop of 30-year-old parents and their toddlers. By now, in his late 80s, Silas decided that he deserved a bit of luxury in his old age. He also reckoned that he no longer needed to give the same degree of thought to the future than had been his previous instinct and wont. He sold the house for 50 times its original cost in dollar terms, and after an extensive search, moved into a 1-bedroom apartment in Shropshire Place. This he furnished with the double bed and dresser from his and Daisy's bedroom, and such as the living room furniture as he could accommodate, It was the best of both worlds. Silas was surrounded by his own belongings, yet at the same time he was provided with 3 excellent meals per day, all cleaning and laundry service, and an extensive social program of in-house and exterior activities. Throughout their long marriage, Silas had been not only devoted to Daisy, but abidingly faithful. Since her death, however, he had become mindful of the words of the marriage contract and covenant, forsaking all others till death do us part. Death had now parted Silas from Daisy, and after an appropriate period of mourning, Silas came to the conclusion that he no longer felt constrained to forsake all others. To those beyond the walls, it comes as a surprise to learn that the residents of retirement homes have other things on their minds besides their medication, bridge games and accompanied excursions to the shopping mall. But it is nevertheless a fact. Moreover, demographics conspire towards a reality that there are far fewer male than female residents. Of the former, even fewer have the erect carriage displayed by Silas, of whom the pre-positive impression was accentuated by his bright blue eyes, and the fact that he was always smartly dressed in dress pants, shirt and cardigan, rather than the sweatpants and ill-fitting golf shirts favoured by most of the male residents. Silas Robbins was therefore quite a hit with the ladies of Shropshire Place, not only those of his own decade, but also those significantly younger. Ladies enjoyed being seen on his arm, and he affected an almost courtly demeanour that increased his desirability even more. As a member of the Residents' Council, Silas had been made aware by the management of their concerns about what they referred to politely as scandal. This was a euphemism for the management's disapproval of social interactions that involved residents spending the night in each other's rooms. Silas, however, was sufficiently outspoken to tell the manager, Mrs. Maybury, that it was none of her damn business. We're all adults here. This is a residence, not a nunnery, and at $4,000 a month we can do what we damn well please, so long as we don't burn the place down. Although the matter continued to be raised from time to time by the management at meetings with the Residents' Council, it proved impossible for the management to extinguish the libidinous flames that burn surprisingly brightly among the elderly. On one occasion, when Mrs. Maybury suggested tactlessly that she did not want the guests of Shropshire Place turning the establishment into a brothel, Silas had responded with considerable asperity that, at $4,000 a month, we residents are by no means guests at Shropshire Place. We live here and pay plenty of rent for the privilege. And as for turning the place into a brothel, I can assure you and the rest of the management that no time has any money changed hands. So it's about time you stop being such a prude. It was therefore somewhat ironic, under these circumstances, that Silas himself should become a central player in one of the scandals so deplored by the management. Elsie Carty, a mere stripling in her late 70s, had developed feelings for Silas. The two of them had become frequent companions, and it was not uncommon for Silas to share the double bed that Silas had brought with him to Shropshire Place. Unbeknownst to the management, but definitely known to Jasmine, who cleaned Silas's room, Elsie kept a change of clothes in Silas's dresser, so she would not have to walk the corridors in her nightclothes in the morning hours. One Saturday morning, Silas awoke in Elsie's arms where he had fallen asleep during the night. Finding it uncommonly difficult to extricate himself from her embrace, Silas noticed that Elsie's skin was unusually cool to the touch. Gradually, the realization dawned upon him that Elsie had passed away during the night, was now lying dead in his arms. The combination of the bedclothes and the high settings of the thermostats in Shropshire Place had retarded the cooling of Elsie's body sufficiently that she had not awoken Silas. However, sufficient time had now passed, the rigor mortis was well advanced, thus explaining the difficulty with which Silas eventually disentangled himself. The time being only just after 6, the situation presented Silas with a dilemma. Should he try to dress Elsie? How and when should he report Elsie's death? On the first point he decided no, both because it would be difficult to dress someone who was so stiff, and because even with Elsie dressed, it would not gloss over the circumstances of the events that had taken place. Regarding the second question, in typical human manner, Silas procrastinated. He decided to have his morning shower and shave and get dressed. From his knowledge of the night staff, he realised that nothing much could be done until the day shift arrived. So he partook of his usual breakfast when the dining room opened at 8 o'clock. Silas's attitude towards this course of events may seem a little callous, but in his mind Elsie was a friend, albeit more than a casual one, rather than a long-term partner. And so only after breakfast did he present himself at Mrs. Mabry's office. "I'm afraid I have some sad news, Mrs. Mabry. My friend Elsie Carter passed away during the night." "I'm very sorry to hear that, Silas," responded Mrs. Mabry with uncharacteristic gentleness. "Has the doctor been called, do you know?" "No, I'm telling you first. You're the first to know," responded Silas. "Well, where is Elsie? Is she in her room?" asked Mrs. Mabry. "No, actually she's in my room," confessed Silas. Mrs. Mabry gave Silas a disapproving stare. "I suppose I don't need to ask what she was doing there, but how come she's dead?" "She must have just passed away in the night," answered Silas. "Well then," said Mrs. Mabry, taking control of the situation, "we have to get Dr. Vickery to sign the death certificate. I'll go down myself to your room as soon as I've called him. Meanwhile, you are to stay out of your room." It occurred to Silas that his decision to get showered and dressed before announcing Elsie's death had been a very wise one. He might otherwise have been forced to spend the morning traipsing about in his pyjamas. Indeed, that would have been the case, for Dr. Vickery did not arrive until 11:30. He was quickly able to pronounce Elsie dead, but since her death unanticipated, it was necessary to involve the coroner's office. When the coroner called Dr. Vickery on Monday morning to ascertain further details about Elsie's death, he laughed uproariously when his colleague told him about how he had found Elsie's vibrator partly wedged under her body and about the bottle of lubricant on the night table. "Amazing what these old geezers get up to, eh?" exclaimed the coroner, once he'd recovered his breath from laughter. "Yeah," replied Dr. Vickery, "and the old boy she was with was in the late 80s. Some of them sure seem to have a healthy libido. Gives you a bit of optimism for the future, eh?" And his colleague agreed, averring that, well, if you got to go, I guess it's nice to go out with a smile on your face. Back at Shropshire Place that previous Saturday, it had not been possible to keep the details of Elsie's death confidential. A sheet-covered body had been seen proceeding from Silas's room towards the rear exit, and the funeral home's hearse. Since Silas himself was present at lunch, large as life, and clearly not a phantasm, and Elsie was not, it was not hard to put 2 and 2 together and arrive at the answer 4. Opinion among the residents was divided about 2 to 1 concerning the circumstances surrounding the death of their colleague. The majority opinion was that what people did in their own suites on their own time was entirely their own business. And more than one, ladies as well as gentlemen, made comments or thought them similar in flavour to that of the concerns of the coroner, that there were indeed worse ways to go than Elsie's when your time came. Far from being a pariah, Silas was extended expressions of sympathy on the loss of his friend by this group, and some of their condolences were accompanied by more or less obvious smiles, particularly by the men. Some of the ladies even took note privately that the death of Elsie might open up new opportunities for companionship with Silas, though none was so crass as to voice this sentiment openly. The minority, especially those schooled from their youth in the theology of St. Augustine, took an altogether less favourable view of the circumstances. Sin, after all, was sin, and the mere fact of living in a retirement home did not somehow lift the prohibition against fornication. It's hard to say what deluge of emotions coursed through the minds of these worthies. Was it their perpetual lifelong struggle against the wiles of Satan, combined with suppressed regret at having lived a blameless life in this regard? Was it envy, conflated with lack of opportunity? Or was it disgust, expressed through pursed lips at these kinds of going on, or some combination thereof? Who could tell? Among Silas's 3 children, Tom, Vera and Janice, opinion on the unfortunate situation was also divided 2 to 1, but here the nays were in the ascendant. Mrs. Maybury had not foregone the opportunity to make her views on the matter known, and had telephoned Vera to express her concern at the possibility that a miasma of scandal might envelop Shropshire Place to the detriment of all concerned, residents, their families, management, and the community at large. It was determined that a family conference should be arranged with Silas to discuss the situation. This took place 2 weeks later in the community room that could be reserved for family events such as birthday parties. Tom brought with him his second wife, Suzanne. Vera came with her common-law husband, Ed, and Janice, recently divorced, came alone. Vera opened the proceedings by stating that she was very concerned for Silas's reputation. Having been a pillar of the community as franchisee of the John Deere farm equipment dealership, a former president of the Lions Club, and an executive member of the local Progressive Conservative Association, she feared that this kind of unsavoury publicity would damage people's respect for her father in the town. Tom concurred with Vera's assessment. Janice, however, said that Tom and Vera should learn to live and let live. Silas, the object of this moralising, heard them out before putting his own position before them. They were, he said, nothing but a bunch of hypocrites, especially Tom and Vera. He, Silas, had spent over 60 years faithful to their mother Daisy and had never regretted a minute of it. He had loved her, as they all well knew. However, he reminded them, the vows of marriage state quite clearly that the covenant between husband and wife is till death us do part. And he had upheld his part of that bargain. Who were they to criticise what he might do in his old age? The question of his or the family's reputation was, as he put it, a bunch of crap, as they all well knew. Who were all these people who would lose respect for him? Practically everyone he knew was dead. And who were any of them to moralise about his behaviour? They were hardly in any position to do so. Proverbial glass-house people throwing stones. You, Vera, you dare to come here and criticise me in my own home, as at that, when you left Joseph to hop in the sack with Mike? And Ed, here is your third shack-up arrangement. So it's all right for you to live unmarried with Ed, but it's not all right for me to sleep with Elsie. That's it? Then there's Tom. OK, you're married to Suzanne, but I seem to recall that she was your receptionist at the clinic when you broke up with Martha, and that Suzanne was the one who went with you and shared a room with you at all those medical conferences. I guess you'd claim it was just to save money. Suzanne reddened visibly at this. And Janice, you're not doing so well in the marriage stakes either. This is your second divorce. The fact is, you can all claim to be monogamous, or mostly monogamous, but it's definitely serial monogamy with all of you. And I'd say that your commitment to the marriage bed has been a lot less than mine. So as far as what I do here, you can like it or you can do the other thing. For my part, this meeting's over. And with that, Silas walked out, leaving his children and their partners in a state of stunned embarrassment. The events of that afternoon introduced more than a little frost into the relationship between Silas and his 3 children. Visits to Shropshire Place by the younger Robbins generation became less frequent and more strained. Silas has always been blunt-spoken, and his relationship with his children had always been less than suffocatingly close. Nevertheless, the altercation over the circumstances of Elsie Carter's death had surprised Tom, Vera and Janice with the intensity of Silas's reaction to their criticism. Perhaps it shouldn't have, but it did. A couple of years later, a new cloud appeared on the horizon of the aggregated Robbins clan. Following the financial crisis of 2008, a new era of minimal interest rates and quantitative easing was intended to kickstart the stalled economy. For the Silas Robinses of this world, with their life savings tied to the interest rates of guaranteed investment certificates, this new economic order was nothing short of catastrophe. Along with the pension funds and those taking out annuities, the holders of GICs watched the income from their investments dry up. The principal from the sale of the house on Woodland Avenue, whose 50-fold increase in monetary value had seemed so munificent at the time of the sale, now delivered far less in interest than the $5,000 per month that was now required to rent a suite at Shropshire Place. As the rent on his suite had increased from $4,000 to $5,000 monthly, the income from his GICs had declined, as the certificates invested at 6% when the house had sold now came to maturity and had to be reinvested at only 2%. Silas thus observed the principle of his nest egg being eroded far faster than he had anticipated, and questions had for some time begun to surface in his mind as to whether he would indeed outlive his financial resources. It wasn't that his intention was, or not particularly, that he should leave an inheritance for his children. He was not one of the elderly folk of the television commercials who take out life insurance late in life so as to guarantee a bequest to their children or grandchildren. Quite to the contrary, Silas was firmly of the opinion that his children's financial stability was their own responsibility. He and Daisy had gone without in order to launch the 3 children as best they could by assisting them with higher education at university, Tom, or obtaining a diploma in nutritional science and dietetics, Vera, and useless in his opinion at art school for Janice. However, the 3 children, grasping as they were for Silas's estate, had little doubt that the vultures of the financial crisis must be picking over the carcass of their anticipated legacy. And so it was that Silas, now well into his 90s, eventually felt compelled to convene another family meeting with his 3 children, notwithstanding his distaste for doing so, on the grounds of both personal pride at his diminished financial health and some embarrassment over the memory of the previous occasion when the family had formally gathered together. This meeting, once again in the family room of Shropshire Place, took place in a somewhat sombre atmosphere. This time, Silas opened the proceedings. He thanked them all for coming and announced that he had something of import to say to them. After your mother died, I stayed on, as you know, for a number of years at the old home. But it was getting lonely for me because everyone I knew had moved away. So eventually I decided to spend my last years here at Shropshire Place. It seemed to me that my savings, plus what I got from selling the house, would be plenty to last me out, even if I lived another 10 years, and I would still be able to leave something left over for the 3 of you. But as you probably realise, things have changed. The returns on the GICs I invested have been terrible, I'd say pitiful, since the financial crash, and I've been eating into the principal in order to be able to stay here at Shropshire Place. After all, it's been my home now for quite a few years. At first it didn't seem to matter. I only had to use up a little bit of the principal each month, and I figured that things would soon turn themselves around and interest rates would go up again. But that hasn't happened, and I find that the interest I get keeps going down as the principal gets used up, and I'm eating into the principal faster and faster. It's a downward spiral. I've basically come to the conclusion that I'll have to give up Shropshire Place. What I'll do then, I don't know. I'm not as young as I was, and I reckon that the last while has shown me that I'm not so good at making plans. Maybe you three could help me get a room somewhere that I can live off my CPP and OAS. It won't be anything grand like I've got now. But as you know, I can't say I regret my time here. It's been the one time of luxury I've had in my life. And I suppose if I have to pay for it now, it will have been worth it. I'm not asking any of you to take me in, and anyway, I doubt any of you would want to. There was a somewhat shocked silence. You mean, said Tom, that all the money's gone and you're really broke? That's about it, replied Silas. After the official meeting broke up, a post-meeting conference was held in the immaculately manicured parking lot of Shropshire Place. Vera, who had not forgotten that she had borne the brunt of Silas's invective at the family meeting 2.5 years previously, was the most forthright. I just can't believe it. He's gone through all the money and now expects us to sort them out or bail him out. I'm not sure which. I don't buy that. I'm not asking any of you to take me in business. Sound like him just trying to put a guilt trip on the three of us. I don't know about that, said Janice. But I guess I had hoped there'd be a bit of something left for us when he passed on. Things are pretty tight for me right now, she added wistfully. Neil never did pay up the alimony he owed me after the divorce, and I don't have the money to hire another lawyer and go after him again. A bit of something, exclaimed Vera. He's run through all the money living the high life at Shropshire Place and shagging his broads. Disgusting at his age. None of us will ever be able to afford that kind of luxury. Remember, it was Mom's saving too. I've been counting on getting my piece of the action for the kitchen reno we need. Come on, Bea, broke in Tom, be fair. He and Mom did scrimp and save most of their lives. I guess he felt he was entitled to a bit of luxury in his declining years. He just went overboard. But he couldn't have guessed that the money would reach its sell-by date before he did. No one could. I just can't believe what I'm hearing, interjected Janice. What you all seem to be saying is that you think Dad, our own father, has lived too long because he's run out of money. Can't you hear yourselves? Well, I didn't mean it quite like that, said Tom a bit sheepishly. I was just trying to explain that it's a pity that his savings didn't last as long as he has. Bullshit, replied Janice. What you and Vera both said is crystal clear. Dad shouldn't have spent his money living here because you both wanted to get a piece of it. He should have moved into some crummy dump somewhere when he sold the house. When you come to think about it, I guess I wanted it too. He's lived too long and he didn't die quick enough. I feel dirty and I'm going home. Later, much later, meaning days later, when tempers had cooled, Janice initiated a series of telephone calls to her brother. What do you think we should do about Dad, was the gist of her opening remarks. They agreed, all three of them. They couldn't afford to keep Silas at Shropshire Place, even if they shared the expenses. Even divided by 3, you were talking 20,000 each a year. Equally, none of them could seriously contemplate the thought of Silas as a house guest, even on a rotating basis. They'd never been lovey-dovey close to their father. This was actually somewhat surprising given the deep and long-lasting bond of affection that had existed between Silas and Daisy. Moreover, Silas's tactless approach to conversation had become increasingly undiplomatic as the years passed. Realistically, that left the only option of a retirement home, not of the ilk of Shropshire Place, but one geared towards the less affluent. Silas gave the management of Shropshire Place 2 months' notice. His family helped him move into Pineview Care and Rest Home, one cold November Saturday afternoon. The contrast with Shropshire Place was stark. Whether there had ever been any pines to view was unclear, though unlikely. The view from most of the rooms mainly consisted of close-ups of low-income apartment blocks. Carpeted hallways and panelled walls at Shropshire Place gave way at Pineview to linoleum tiles and concrete block walls, painted an institutional pale cream. The library, with its imported British magazines, gave way to, well, nothing, although there were some outdated and dog-eared copies of Chatelaine and Maclean's magazine in the reception area downstairs. Whereas quality newspapers were available daily in the library at Shropshire Place, the best that could ever be hoped for at Pineview was an occasional copy of The Sun, abandoned by one of the staff. Afternoon tea at 4 o'clock and china teapots with delicate pastries was replaced by tea from a trolley in mugs at 2:30, with a choice of apple juice if preferred, and a store-bought cookie. As to the furniture that Silas had brought from the family home to Shropshire Place, all that could be fitted in around the hospital bed and the institutional dresser was a single easy chair. Children tried their best to make the room a little more cheerful by having Silas welcome that first day with a vase of flowers on the dresser and by buying him a new flat-screen television. Shropshire Place had been a retirement facility, meaning that the residents were all able-bodied, some of them continuing even to maintain their own automobiles. At such a point in their lives that they might require nursing care, they were obliged to leave Shropshire Place, possibly to one of Retirement Horizon's companion nursing homes, such as Sunset Towers. The clientele at Pineview, by contrast, ran the gamut from those like Silas, reasonably able-bodied but resourceless, to those in long-term care, with conditions such as dementia, Parkinson's disease, and advanced diabetes. The harried staff did their best to care for their charges, inmates Silas calls them, as best they could, but here the laundry was returned unironed, not always to its original owner, despite the name tags sewn into the various items. The difference in the clientele at Pineview made others of the divergences between what was offered at the two institutions irrelevant. The world-weary residents of Pineview had no thought of bed hopping, so it mattered not that Silas had been required to give up the double bed he'd once shared with Daisy. The extensive social programme at Shropshire Place, outings in the facilities minibus, organised bridge games, talks by interesting local sports and business celebrities, and occasional concerts by solo or group musicians, had no part in the lives of the residents of Pineview. Their amusement was confined to the weekly church service on Thursday afternoon, run by a rotation of ministers from the local churches, and Tuesday sing-songs, with luck accompanied by a pianist, otherwise featuring CDs played by the staff. Silas, no devout churchman at the best of times, looked with utter contempt at the weekly offerings of the local ministers, whose homilies that Jesus loved the inmates bore mute testimonies to the fact that, in reality, he appeared to have forgotten them. Lusty singing by the minister and his assistants of What a Friend We Have in Jesus, and Blessed Assurance Jesus is Mine, while the majority of the inmates variously drooled or fell asleep, failed completely to awaken any dormant religious instinct in him. Though it must be admitted that he did enjoy ogling the well-stacked lady assistant minister who came with the Baptists. Likewise, You Are My Sunshine and Down by the Old Mill Stream on Tuesdays failed to make Silas's spirit soar. In the environment of Shropshire Place, the residents, elderly though they were, had been kept entertained, and those who wished it had plentiful company. At Pineview, there were few residents with whom Silas could have had a conversation, let alone an interesting conversation, and Silas's acerbic wit atrophied to a level commensurate with that of most of the other residents. Unsurprisingly, Silas was lonely and depressed. The sprightly nonagenarian of Shropshire Place soon developed into an aging man with a slight stoop and incipient shuffle. The smart dress pants had somehow gone missing, to be replaced by the universal uniform of track pants, and the cardigan was often stayed with food. Vera and Tom almost never visited. Janice did her best, but as the least affluent of them, she found that the hour-long bus ride from home made visiting demanding, and she came less frequently than she would have wished. A little more than 2 years after Silas had become a resident of Pineview Care and Rest Home, the forced jollity of Valentine's Day rolled round again, with the heart-shaped cookies served at the 2:30 tea trolley and the single red rose on each table at 5:30 p.m. supper. But few of the residents had anyone to love or to be loved by, even those who had retained the ability to contemplate the emotion. Silas, roomy-eyed, retired to his room, thought once more of his beloved Daisy and the happy life they'd shared together, and decided that tonight was his time to die.